Welcome everyone to the first session of the IIT Madras Alumni Association Photography Club. Um, with us is our three instructors. I'm going to let Sridhar Bhuvaragavan, sorry about that, Sridhar Bhuvaragavan, President of IIT Ma, who's also the instructor for session 3, take over and welcome you all. Before I do though, I'd like just to clear up some housekeeping. Um, since this is a webinar, we'd like to keep participants on mute and with their cameras off. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box. I'll be posting reminders constantly in the chat box every 10-15 minutes or so that you can ask your questions for the instructor and we will get to them at the end of the session. Sridhar, over to you.
Thank you, Rohan. So, welcome all, and I love the enthusiasm with which people have joined the WhatsApp group as well as registered for these sessions. We hope that we are going to create a space in which all of you guys could participate, learn, participate, and also constructively criticize other people's photographs and learn from that as well, right? So this is a new thing for us in IIT Ma in starting this kind of a hobby club. You guys know that the Alumni Association has a lot of chapter-based chapters, city-based chapters, geographically distributed all around the world. We conduct events. We are looking for, let's say, 4 events a year with one big annual chapter meet. But this is going in a different direction. It is looking to get all of you guys across geographies who are interested in a certain topic talking, right? And this fits exactly with our main objective, which is to increase alumni engagement. And believe me, we've had a lot of engagement in the WhatsApp group. We are very gratified with the response, and we hope that it'll only go further. And we have a excellent set of instructors. I'm not including myself, but both Praveen and Sam are photographers that have got a lot of experience, and I am glad that they quickly, practically, immediately agreed to do this for you, do this for us, right? So, really happy that we are in a place where we can share some of the basics to slightly advanced techniques. And there were a lot of questions about phone photography, camera photography, and so on. Yes, we will talk about techniques that could be done on the phone as well as on the camera. So this is more about learning about techniques to take a good photo, right? It could work on the camera if you have those controls, but it will definitely work. I'm sorry, on the phone if you have those controls, but it will definitely work on the camera, which usually have these controls. So you can also use these sessions as an upgrade path as you yourself are learning about these techniques, and you can see the limitations of the current device that you're working with, and you can see what more can, let's say, like in Sam's case, right? You see those big lens that he was holding, the 600 f4. You will see what it is used for and why I need such an equipment in a certain case, right? And he will talk about that in coming sessions. So without further ado, I am so glad to get this thing started. Let me introduce or I'll have Praveen, the instructor for session 2, go through a brief introduction, and then we will hand it over to Sam. Thank you.
Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Praveen Ramanathan. I'm based in California, if you can see behind me. So today's session Session 1, Samyukt Sridharan will be
Your voice is a little bit low. Could I ask you to maybe speak up a little bit?
Sure. Is it better now?
Yeah, better.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Praveen Ramanathan. I'm based in California, and today's session will be hosted by Samyukt Sridharan, who is an avid wildlife photographer and a Nikon enthusiast. So without too much delay, I'll hand it over to Samyukt to get started.
Hey, thanks, guys. Let me quickly switch to the presenter mode. And yeah, so we're going to do a quick 40-minute session here, right? Typically, what any intro to photography workshop does over a day. So we're going to pack a lot in, and it might at times seem a little fast. We're going to share the material with you at the end of the session. So you do have access to all the stuff that we have discussed, and then we'll use the WhatsApp group for any follow-up Q&A after the session, right? Just while I get this going. Yeah, okay. So quick background, 91 batch, Mandak, which unfortunately is not Mandak anymore or whatever. It's not in the way it was, the way when I remember it. Basically a Nikon guy. Started off with Nikon, eventually went to Nikon D500, refused to move to the more upgraded mirrorless version, and we'll spend some time talking about the differences. You've seen me in my profile shot that we said with the large 600 but my preference these days is for more flexible, smaller lenses with wider, larger story to tell. And my favorite location to shoot in is Bharatpur. If you've been there, it's a brilliant place, especially when you have fog. What we aim to cover today is basically this, right? We will spend about 10 odd minutes understanding how a digital camera does what it does. It might seem very basic to many people, but it's probably the only way you can play with light when you understand how your camera actually can work and how can you play with different settings. How can you manipulate what you see to eventually generate an image that you're thinking of, right? And you've seen somewhere and you want to reproduce, right? So all of that is only possible if you know the equipment that you're using, right? And we'll understand some bit about how that works. We will spend a lot of time on the exposure triangle, and this is something that you'll hear across all sessions going forward. So let's demystify what that is. And then we will end the session with a quick look at what, once you click an image, what's the horoscope of the image and what do you learn from it, right? What we call the EXIF. I've got a second screen so that we can stick to the time. So I'll keep switching between two screens in terms of just the way where I'm looking. So that's not being distracted. That's just me referring to notes, keeping to time, right? So that's broadly it. Let's start with looking at what a digital camera is, right? All of us know, many of us were probably born, as in guys like me were born in the film camera age. Digital camera basically started off when we finished college. And the basic difference at its core is essentially the sensor, right? Replacing a film with a digital sensor. And that sensor essentially over the last 25 years has evolved and morphed into a bunch of things, right? The DSLR, or a digital single lens reflex, is essentially a camera that uses a digital sensor with a mirror to reflect the light coming from the object into the viewfinder, right? Works with interchangeable lenses, manual controls, great low light capability, and we'll see that in a live setting 20-25 minutes later once I switch to a live camera. Obviously, they were expensive to start with, so there entered the compact point and shoot, which basically didn't have interchangeable lens. It had fixed lenses with a zoom. much smaller with a smaller sensor, but was good for everyday photography, right? Many of us probably have used it or maybe started with it. We are now in a mirrorless era where instead of a mirror reflecting through the lens, what you see on the viewfinder is essentially what your sensor sees, right? And that's at its core, that's the basic difference, right? With no mirror, it means that you are seeing what you see is what you get. And it is much more compact because it doesn't have that mirror moving parts, has the same interchangeable lens, probably far better to shoot videos in. And more or less Nikon, Canon, Sony, all of them over the last few years have basically been coming out with different versions of mirrorless, right? And the last one, which probably all of us carry, is the smartphone, right? And a lot of people in the group have been talking about smartphone photography, etc. And we'll talk about the basic difference, right? It all boils down to what are the physical limitations of a small sensor, and that's broadly the difference, right, between what a smartphone camera can do. The limitations it tries to overcome using computational photography. Somebody in the group had a discussion going about that. Basically using computational photography to overcome the challenges of there being a small sensor, right? So that's broadly the 4 types of digital cameras. I'm omitting the larger format ones, which probably cost an arm and a leg. But this is broadly the equipment that we work with, right? Let's spend some time on the sensor, right? So like I said, the sensor is basically the digital version of the film, right? With phenomenally large advantages, right? Everybody would have heard of pixels. So basically picture elements with photo sites, with filters, with micro lenses, all of them geared to capturing the image that you are composing as closely as possible, given limitations of technology and physicality, right? So you have to understand that the human eye is probably the best camera you can have, right? Has great dynamic range. Any equipment that you use, regardless of what it is, struggles to really get close to the human eye, right? But the DSLR and the mirrorless get as close today as we can, right? While we talk about DSLR, basically the sensor size determines a few things, right? You must have heard people talk about a full frame DSLR, right? And a full frame DSLR is nothing but a sensor that is exactly the same size as a 35 mm film, right? It's essentially 36 by 24. That's the sensor size. And as you go down the DSLRs and into smartphones, the sensor size becomes smaller, right? The size is basically the limiting factor for a lot of things, right? Limiting factor for why you can't get the same quality of images on a smartphone that you can get on a high-end DSLR, right? The limiting factor is the sensor size, and it's basically because of 4 things, right? One is that physically, if your sensor is 1/30th or 1/40th the size of a full frame camera, you're going to struggle to put pixels in, right? If you put pixels in, they're going to be super small. And when they are small and cramped together, your ability to capture light perfectly deteriorates drastically, right? And that's at its core the problem, right? Between a small smartphone sensor and a high-end full-frame DSLR, right? In terms of size, basically we are talking about 35x difference in the sensor size between a full frame and a smartphone, and between a crop sensor and a smartphone, roughly about 25x, right? So fairly large, substantial difference in size of the sensor, right? Now this limits a few things, right? What it limits, and we'll speak about this in our sessions, and I'll start by, in one of my sites, talking about depth of field, right? When we go into exposure, The size of the sensor limits the ability for you to control depth of field, right? And we'll discover over the next few sessions how that is important to really making great images, right? But smartphones produce great images themselves, right? How do they do it? A lot of technology and computational photography, which overcome these limitations and essentially ensure that what you can do with a high-end camera, you can computationally try and get close to on a small screen using a smartphone, right? Once you start blowing up those images onto larger screen, you will notice those differences, right? So as long as you're using smartphones in your small screen for social media, they all look good. But once you start looking at, hey, can I print these or can I look them on a large screen or on my iMac at home, then you'll start seeing those edges being frayed, right? So that's broadly the difference as I see it, right? How does this work, right? How does any camera work, right? Basically, you have a lens. Lights from the subject reflected falls through the lens onto a mirror. This mirror reflects that light through a pentaprism and you see it in your viewfinder, right? So when you're looking through your viewfinder, this is what you see, right? Obviously, this light is flipped and transposed, but in the viewfinder, because you go through 2 or 3 reflections, you basically have corrected that, right? So what you see is essentially what you see on the field, right? What you see with your eyes is what you see in the viewfinder, right? Behind the mirror is the sensor, right? This is where your image capture happens. Sensor is placed at the focal length. And there is a screen in front of the sensor called a focal plane shutter, right? Now, essentially, how it works is this, right? So when you take a cross section, and if you see the left-hand image, you have light passing through your lens, right? And which will have different multiple glasses in it of different, basically convex glasses. You're seeing it through this reflected path in your viewfinder. And when you click the shutter, you see this mirror moving up, light passes straight through, hits the sensor, you capture the image. Now this image obviously is inverted, right? So it gets flipped computationally, and what you finally see in your JPEG or RAW image in your live view screen or your small screen at the back is exactly what you shot, right? So that's the mechanics of how it works, right? Let's move to how does this produce an image, right? Essentially 4 elements to an image, right? First is your subject, how well focused it is, what's the perspective you're shooting from. Second, what's the background? How clean, how crowded, is it distracting? All of that put together, right? Your entire background. Third is placement of the subject in the entire frame, right? Which is broadly what we call composition, and we'll cover that in session 2 and session 3. And just the spacing between and the breathing space that you see in that photograph, right? We will come to this corner bit called the EXIF in the last section so that you understand how to read it. But broadly, this is an image shot with a 600 mm lens, shot at 1/3200th of a second, with a f number 5, ISO 400, right? This was, if I remember, I shot this at about 9:45 in the morning, right? So well lit, broadly lit, Falcon taking off, right? Now, what this image doesn't tell you is that it took good 90 minutes of waiting just for this one shot, right? So there's a lot of work that goes behind images, right? It's not just pointing and shooting. It is waiting for the right opportunity. And that's something that hopefully over the next few sessions, we will cover as well. So in that image, right, 3 things I spoke about, right? One is the perspective that you brought when you shot that image. Second is the placement of the elements, right? Where's the subject? Where's the background? How is it all laid out together? Where's the negative space, positive space, etc. The third one is exposure. And we are going to spend the next 20 minutes, hopefully, on exposure, talking about the principles and going to my studio rig that I've set up to show you what all of this means, right? So what's exposure, right? At its core, it's basically light falling on a sensor, captured. The light falls for a specified duration of time. It is shot with certain settings. And the three principal settings that make up exposure are shutter speed, aperture value, and ISO. Shutter speed is the easiest to understand, right? So let's start with that. And if you look at the image, right, it tells you how the shutter works, right? So you've seen the lens cross-section, right? Now, what happens when the mirror moves up? I showed you that there is a screen in front of the sensor, right? Now, the screen is basically two screens, right? What is called a rear curtain and a front curtain. Front curtain is the one facing the lens. Rear curtain is the one next to the sensor, right? Now, the way it works is that they don't open both together. If you notice, they actually open one after the other, right? And that's super important. I remember posting an image in the WhatsApp group this morning, right? If you didn't understand this, you wouldn't have been able to take that picture, right? It's important to understand these elements to try and get the best out of the camera that you have, right? I'll still not answer that question, and we'll probably cover that in a further section. But this is broadly what the shutter is, right? How do you measure it? Shutter speed is basically measured in hundreds or thousands of a second, right? So typically the range in a normal DSLR is 1/8,000th of a second, going all the way up to a 30-second exposure, right? Or a bulb. The amount of time a shutter is opened is what actually determines the light falling on the sensor, right? So if a shutter is open for a large period of time in bright daylight, so try this on your camera, what you will see is a completely white image, right? Because essentially you let phenomenal amounts of light over a large period of time fall on the sensor, and essentially everything is just white light, right? Conversely, if you have a shutter speed of 1/8,000 and shoot it in the dark, you will essentially see a black image, right? Which is the complete converse of what I just said about the whites, about a 30-second exposure, right? So shutter speed determines how much of light is allowed to fall on the sensor and is captured to make your image, right? Now, why is shutter speed important, right? Controlling shutter speed helps you control a lot of things, right? 90% of the images that you see will be sharp images, right? They happen because there is a certain principle around sharpness. And as long as you have shutter speeds faster than that, typically the way you expose your subjects will be sharp, right? There are, of course, people who play with slow speeds. So for instance, slower the speeds, you will capture subject blur, motion blur, techniques like intentional camera movements, panning, zoom burst, all of those require much slower shutter speeds than what your camera tells you, right? So the shutter speed is a super important part of your image. It makes or breaks your image. A great thought that you have can essentially get ruined just because the shutter speed is wrong, right? And it's one of the core principles of exposure, right? Getting shutter speed right is super important to a good image. Basic thumb rules are very simple, right? You check your lens focal length. Any speed greater than 1 by focal length should, under normal conditions, give you decent sharp images, right? So if you're shooting with a 100 mm lens, 100 is a decent speed. Many lenses today come with image stabilization, which means that you can get away with slower shutter speed, and image stabilization basically gives you that extra stabilization that requires you to shoot at a slower shutter speed, right? While we are here, it's important to understand a concept called stops. And you will hear this both in aperture, shutter, and ISO, right? And let me explain this with a simple example, right? So let's assume that you're shooting a portrait with 100 shutter speed. One stop is essentially the shutter speed that allows twice the amount of light to either fall higher or lower, right? So typically 1/200th, which is a faster shutter speed, will allow half the amount of light to fall, and that is considered one stop, right? Conversely, if you shoot at 1/50th, your one stop slower, which means you're letting twice the amount of light to fall, right? So the shutter speed and stops in combination will essentially help you manipulate between a 1/200th, 1/320th, 1/400th, 1/800th, and whatever shutter speed that you see in your camera, right? All of these you can see in your smartphones as well, right? Not especially if you're using apps that allow you to look at and manually control shutter and aperture. You'll be able to do a lot of this on your smartphones as well, right? The same principle, right? And simple hacks. So like I said, one hack is one bifocal length. And simple hacks around what it takes to capture different types of motion. So people walking, typically 1/200th, 1/250th, you should be able to more or less freeze the motion. Kids playing, they are more skittish. They are erratic, so you'll require a faster shutter speed. If you're shooting sports, cars, you probably are looking at anywhere between 1,000 to 1/2000. If you're shooting a peregrine falcon or a hummingbird in flight, you probably need 1/2000, maybe even 1/4000, right? So the faster your action is, your shutter speed needs to be much smaller to ensure that you're freezing the action, right? You would have seen photographs of water that looks like silk, waterfall. How does that happen? Essentially, you shoot with slow shutter speeds. When you shoot with slow shutter speeds, essentially that waterfall is captured over a longer period. And as the water is moved, what you get is more a silky blur rather than just the water, right? And that's the principle around just slow shutter speed, right? You also need slow shutter speeds when you are doing, let's say, light trails, star trails, night scenes. You would have probably observed it when you shoot in the evening with your smartphones, that your shutter speeds are much slower as well, right? The other use case for much slower shutter speeds are more creative stuff, like I mentioned, panning. We'll speak about it sometime later in one of the other sessions, or zoom bursts, or intentional camera movements, and some more zany techniques, right? So that's broadly, in a nutshell, what shutter speeds is, right? And basically, it helps you freeze, right? So you are looking at action, you want to freeze it, you go as fast as you can on your shutter to ensure that you're seeing, that you're capturing the image the way that you want, right? The second aspect of exposure is aperture, right? Simply put, aperture is the opening in the lens, right? Think about it like a human eye, right? You open your eye wide when it's dark, so that's like your aperture, right? So your eyeballs opening up, squinting, essentially is mimicking, that's what aperture in terms of action mimics, right? Logically, the larger the opening, more light enters, which means that you can work with faster shutter speeds and freeze action, right? So think about aperture in conjunction with shutter speeds, and we'll go to that in a few minutes to demonstrate. But broadly, aperture size of the opening in the lens, right? On your camera, you'll be able to set apertures from anywhere between typically 22.8 to maybe 32 in many cameras, right? There are some small lenses, prime lenses, which go up to f1. Yeah, so that's the range, right? 1 to 32 is kind of the range. And most digital cameras will allow you to set your aperture if you are shooting in the right mode and manipulate the aperture to achieve an important result. And what's that important result? What is called depth of field, right? Depth of field basically is how much of the frame, how much of the focal plane in the frame is in focus, right? You would have seen landscape shots, right? Landscape shots are one where you've got everything crystal clear, right? Praveen does a lot of landscape and he'll show you some. Essentially, you want as much of the scene in focus as possible. And how do you manage that with aperture? You basically go down to the to an f16, f20, as narrow an aperture as possible, and that influences your depth of field, right? You saw the image that I showed you earlier, the one of the peregrine falcon that was shot wide open, right? The background is completely blurred. It's extremely shallow in terms of depth of field. The only thing that is clear there is the subject and the prop that it's standing on, the lamppost or the post that it's standing on. And that is achieved by shooting with a wide aperture, right? So that's the two ends of the scale, right? You go very wide when you want shallow depth of field. You go, and when you want really deep depth of field, you go very narrow, right? So that's the range of apertures. And like I said, typical use cases, landscape, you want as much in focus as possible. So you go as small an aperture as possible. Portraits, you want to, if your subject is very close, you basically want the subject sharp. And because the subject has depth, you will need to go medium. And like in the image I showed you, you can go really wide for settings that allow you to go wide, where you essentially have a very, very shallow depth of field. You allow your camera to gather as much light as possible. You shoot as fast as possible, and you're able to freeze frames, right? Macro is a specific part, and I'm not sure whether he speaks so much about it, but basically it's photographing really small, tiny objects. And here you are, contrary to what we think, you're going to be shooting with a very high F number, because as you go smaller and smaller, your focal plane in relation to the lens you're using changes drastically, right? So you will need to get very high F numbers to get, let's say, an ant in a macro picture sharp from tip to tail, right? So yeah, that's depth of field. And this is how it looks, right? So this is the difference between a shallow and a deep depth of field, right? The one on the left is shot very shallow, f4. The one on the right is shot with a deeper depth of field. And you can see that you can make out some structure of the grass in the background, right? And that's broadly what control over aperture allows you to do, right? Landscape, like I said, you're basically going as deep as possible because you want to capture as much sharpness across the entire frame as possible. And on portraits, you're going to go as shallow as possible, depending upon the size of the subject in relation to how far you are away from it. That will allow you to capture sharpness, but keep that separation in the background, right? yeah, so that's broadly about aperture, right? Third element of exposure, and we are okay on time, is ISO, right? So think about ISO as making your sensor more sensitive to light, right? So basically, what control over an ISO does is it tells your camera, hey, I want you to amplify the signal from the sensor higher or lower, depending upon where you are, right? Now, why do you need this, right? Typically, you will come across 50% of the times when you're shooting in scenarios where either there is too much light or too little light, right? You will never find really an ideal situation where light is perfect, right? And control over ISO will basically help you give much better control over the other two elements of exposure, right? In a manner that you'll be able to play with them far better, right? Hang on one sec. Now, how did this work in the film world? It basically worked using silver halide crystals. And you would have come across films with ISO 100 versus ISO 400. The difference would be the size of the crystals. Size of the crystal determines the sensitivity, but it comes with an added disadvantage that as you make your film more sensitive, you get more grains. The same thing happens in a digital sensor as well, right? So as you go up ISO, and many DSLRs now go up to insane ranges of 51,200 or even higher, while it allows you to shoot in really tough conditions, it also introduces grains that eventually you'll have to figure out how to post-process and remove, right? So while ISO helps you get a lot of control, it also comes with the disadvantage of ensuring that there is some graininess as you keep going up the ISO ladder, right? So like you see in this girl shot with, at maybe a ISO 100 versus ISO 1600, and once you blow it up on your screen, you would be able to make out the differences, right? Now, how do these three elements interact, right? And for that, I'm going to, rather than the slide, I'm going to stop share and I'm going to switch to a live setup, right? So just give me a sec. And I'm going to switch to Lightroom. And okay, so here is a setup, just set up on my table, right? I've got my camera rigged, and I want you to focus on a few things for now. So I'm using a D500. You see this bar that I'm moving around. Hopefully you can see it. And it's got a few values, right? Hang on. Yeah. So let me start by my standard. Let's look at how the aperture works, right? Notice that I'm at f4.5, right? So I'm as wide as this camera lens will allow me at this point of time, right? Which means that I should get a very shallow depth of field, right? You see two subjects there, a dog and a small little camel kind of thingy, right? Now they are separated by about 2 inches, right? I'm going to shoot a couple of frames for you and we'll look at what the data tells us, right? So I'm shooting basically aperture priority, and Sridhar in the next couple of sessions will talk to you about those modes. And I'm just setting the autofocus so it's focused, and I'm going to click a photo, right? So I've got an image clicked, shallow depth of focus. How does it look? This is how it looks, right? if you look at the data on the side, it tells you what we shot it at. We shot it at 1/200th of a second at f4.5, ISO 1600. Ignore the rest, right? We go back. Now, what happens when I shift to f, let's say 22? Okay, same setting, nothing has changed. Focused, shoot. Go back, let's look at it, right? Now, toggle, I'm just going to toggle between these two images, right? Do you notice in the shallow depth of field, the background object is definitely out of focus. And in the one that is shot with a much deeper depth of field, the object in the background is reasonably in focus. May not be perfect, but reasonably in focus, right? Okay, so that's one bit, right? Let me focus on this subject now with f4.5. So I'm going shallow. I'm shooting this. You should be able to see the difference in your screens. The dog in the foreground is really out of focus, right? Now that's your shallow and deep depth of field difference, right? So here we had the dog in focus. Here we had the camel in focus. Here we had a much deeper depth of field, and you see the difference in images, right? So that's your depth of field demonstration, right? Now let's see what happens when we change different values, right? So I'm shooting at f4.5, 1600. Let's assume that I've got this as the subject. Notice what your shutter speed is, right? I'm getting a 1/160th of a shutter speed, right? Clicking. I knock my ISO down. Let's say I get down to 400, right? You see the shutter speed drop to 1/40th, right? Hope you're able to see it. I click the same image, right? Done nothing different. These two images. Okay. I'm toggling between the two. One shot at 1/160th, ISO 1600. This one shot at ISO 400, 1/40th. So what do you notice here, right? Essentially, as you keep toggling with ISO, you have the ability to impact your shutter speed, right? Same thing you can do with the aperture, right? So again, now focus on the shutter speed here. We are at let's go back to 1600 ISO. Because of the light, we need faster settings. And I'm at ISO 4, I'm at f number 4.5. Hang on. And I click a photo, shutter speed 1/160th. I bump this number to 6.3 or 7.1. Shutter speed drops to 100. I go deeper. Shutter speed drops. So as we go and change our aperture, you can see the impact on shutter speed, right? The final image, really nothing much different, right? It's all roughly the same. Small little delta because of maybe the flickering lights, but nothing else, right? So what this tells us is that there is a relationship between these three elements, right? By ensuring that you're able to control one of them, you will be able to control the other two as well, right? And there is a correlation between these two, right? Switching back to my slide, which is disappeared. One sec. Damn. Yeah. Okay. So we saw that as the shutter speed, we played around with two things. We played around with aperture, we played around with ISO, right? As we increased the aperture size, as we increased the aperture number, F number, right? We went from 4.5 to 7.1 to 11. As we increased that, shutter speed dropped, right? So they are inversely correlated, right? So a wider aperture size basically gives you faster shutter speed and vice versa, right? So inversely correlated, as you change one, the other one goes down the other way, right? ISO also is inversely correlated, right? How do we get faster shutter speed? We increase ISO. How do we get, what happens when we reduce ISO? Shutter speed drops, right? So inversely correlated on between aperture size and shutter speed, inversely correlated between ISO and shutter speed. And essentially these three elements are what we control in the non-auto mode, right? A lot of people typically continue to shoot on auto mode and the camera decides everything, right? Camera decides the right exposure, camera decides, and the right exposure meaning the shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO for that scene that you're framing. You have nothing in control, right? Every digital SLR has at least three modes that you can use, right? So whether it's the aperture priority, shutter priority, or complete manual mode in Nikon, or the aperture value, time value manual in Canon. And these are modes that typically you will use to control these three elements to get the image that you want, right? Now, how does the camera decide and give you these values, right? Because as I changed one, I got another value, right? How did that happen? It happens through a module called metering, right? In the pre-digital era, you would have had camera photographers with light meters. This essentially, in the digital camera and in the more advanced film cameras that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you basically used reflective light and cameras, the technology in the camera to essentially measure that light, right? And then determine what's the optimal setting. Now, how does the camera define optimal, right? That's something that is hard-coded into the camera's firmware, right? And that's decided basis what is considered neutral to the human eye, right? The human eye has a black and a white. And what is neutral is essentially somewhere in the middle, right? Numerically, it is not, because human eye sees light exponentially. So an 18% gray is typically what is across all camera systems coded as optimal, right? Now, why is it important to understand this, right? I don't know if anybody has shot a polar bear in a snow, right? If many of you guys have traveled to Alaska, Kamchatka, Svalbard, and you've come across a polar bear in the snow, you basically got a white on white setting, right? Now, when your camera tells you that, hey, this is an optimal exposure, it's basically telling you that I'm going to expose it like a gray, 18% gray, right? So you would have come back from those brilliant trips, enjoying the sight of that white on white and looking at your image saying, hey, this doesn't do justice, right? The reason for that is because how the camera defines optimal, right? And since that is hard-coded, you need a couple of hacks to basically get around that, right? So we'll speak about that in the next section, but broadly, metering and an optimal hardware, the optimal determination of what is called good exposure, combination of that essentially is what decides the number that you get when you change one or the other, right? Now, the meter picks up the data from your sensor, right? And you can determine which part of the sensor it picks it up from, right? And that's essentially the three different types of metering that you will come across, right? Spot metering, which means that it's a single spot or just the center of that pixel that you've got your focus on. That's what is picked up for determining the metering that it's going to give you. Matrix, when it picks up and samples across the entire frame, or center weighted when it picks up across a smaller part of the frame that you have determined, right? So these are the basically three metering modes. The standard easy to use one is matrix, but there are cases where you need to understand both center weighted and spot, right? Metering, like I said, for a matrix metering, it evaluates light across this entire frame at various different points. It then tells you, hey, for this frame, this is the right optimal setting that you will need. And as you play around with whatever aperture, it will give you the balancing shutter speed. As you play around with ISO, it will give you the balancing shutter speed, etc. Right? So that's broadly how it works. Now, going back to the polar bear in the snow, right? Exposure compensation is that magic button that helps you ensure that you override the optimum, right? Now, where do you use it, right? You basically use it in lots more creative photography, right? Or when you're going to Alaska and seeing a polar bear in the snow, right? Or you've got a black pet cat and it's lying on a black tarpaulin and you're taking a shot, right? When you take a shot, because your optimal setting is 18% gray, you will get more grays than blacks. But then you toy around with exposure compensation and say, hey, I do not want you to allow so much light in. I want you to go darker. So you go negative EV, you are underexposed, and you get the black that you need, right? In the polar bear example, you basically say, hey, I want you to overexpose. I want you to let more light in. I want you to let the scene feel lighter and whiter. And that's broadly what happens, right? And you basically use exposure compensation in photography like rimlets, silhouettes, low key, high key, and we'll probably speak about a few of these in the next few sessions as well, right? The last element that you will need to understand very quickly is just white balance, which is basically telling the camera, hey, I want you to mimic a certain temperature of light while you're creating the frame for me, right? So basically, you define a color temperature. You've got typically most cameras will have auto presets of what daylight, cloudy, shade, but you can also use a temperature scale to say, hey, I want it to go much warmer or much colder, right? These two are essentially what gives you the ability to create a little bit more creativity around the photo, right? Like, for example, this is the scene that I saw. This is what I shot, right? This is what a 18% gray gave me. This is what an exposure compensation allowed me to shoot, right? This is what a standard white balance gave me. This is what Kelvin 10,000 gave me, right? As the sun was breaking through the fog, I wanted the scene to be nice and bright and orange, and I achieved the effect using white balance, right? So that's broadly the 5 elements that you can use to control your film, right? Last bit, probably 10 minutes over on time, but let's quickly look at what the EXIF is, right? EXIF is basically a horoscope, right, of the photo that you shot, right? So in your smartphone cameras, if you go to a photo and click on I, you will get some data, and that data tells you what is the setting you used to shoot. Same thing you can do in a DSLR, and basically it will tell you what is the shutter speed, what's the aperture, what's the ISO, what's the camera model, focal length, exposure compensation, white balance. Cameras now allow you to do date timestamp. Obviously, smartphones allow all of this comes packaged in. And this is useful because you go back, it'll help you go back and quickly fix mistakes that you made in your settings so that you can correct them in the field, right? So keeping a close eye on your EXIF and the data basically helps you learn from your mistakes, improve your skills, and more importantly, on smartphones, because of geotagging, etc., you probably can use it as a great memory recall device as well, right? So what happened in December 2024, and you probably get a good sense of what are the photos you took, right? So that was all for this session, right? Packed a lot of it. This data, the deck will be something that we circulate. And at this point, I'll probably just open it up for Q&A, right? In terms of time, I think we are 55 minutes in. So 10 minutes longer.
Great, Sam. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions here. Just 1 second. First of all, thank you so much for an engaging session. I think it was really great. Vijay asks, do we always need to control ISO manually, or is auto ISO good enough?
See, I am of the belief that controlling each of these elements help you make better images, right? It's very difficult for us. So for instance, very tough for us to imagine, right? What can happen when the ISO goes awry, right? So let's say you're shooting in the dark and your auto ISO setting gives you a very crazy, let's say 7200 ISO, right? At that point, you'll say, hey, okay, I've got my shot. But when you go back and look at it in your larger screen, you'll realize that it's very grainy, right? So typically in a DSLR, I would like to control the ISO. There are times when it breaks everything. What you think is a great image on a small screen on the camera turns out to be grainy. And then you'll have to do a bunch of things to, you have to spend time and maybe software effort to try and see if you can clean that up, right? I would rather, personally speaking, I like to use post-processing as minimal as possible. Beyond just basic sharpening, I don't even post-process, right? I don't like to use post-processing at all. I would rather just shoot and be done, right? Maybe I'm lazy, but it's a personal choice, right? So I think to answer a question very simply, control ISO all the time.
Okay.
Sam, I'd like to add possibly one example. Okay. So I was recently in Kaziranga, the national park, and I was in shutter priority mode, so I had a fairly 1/1/800th of a second exposure. So I wanted to track some, birds and things like that that are fast moving. Okay, but then I went to a different scene where I was shooting rhinos, which are very, very stationary objects, or they move very slowly. I did not need the 1/800th of a second. What happened is that the ISO went up to 25,600 unnecessarily. The light was actually good, but because the shutter speed was so small and I didn't need it, the ISO went up to a degree where it was, unnecessarily introducing noise in the image. So there are things with auto ISO that I completely agree with Sam, that you have to keep a watch on the ISO that the camera is giving you. The auto ISO band nowadays in cameras are fairly huge, and if you have the wrong settings, it could unnecessarily introduce noise in the camera, and we have to keep an eye on it all the time.
Thank you so much, Sridhar. Would you like to add anything, Sam?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of people are answering each other's questions in the chat, because it's great. There's a spirited discussion going on about simple basic questions like, is the M mode in Nikon where we can control all three, aperture, shutter, and ISO? Somebody has already answered that for the other person. So people are happily engaging with one another. A lot of thank yous in the chat as well. Um, I think since we are at time and there's no real pressing questions, I'm sure this discussion will continue on in the WhatsApp groups. I've posted the link to join the WhatsApp group if you're not already there. I'm sure as people watch the recording on YouTube, we'll also get some questions in. As Sam mentioned, we have our next session coming up. It'll be held by Praveen, and it's going to be on December the 6th. It'll be the same time, but a different link. I also got some feedback that the email with the link was not going out properly. So I'm going to look into that and make sure that we can avoid that in the future. And thank you all for joining us. We had at one point over 115 of you. I think in terms of unique people, number of people who joined, we had far closer to 150 or 160. I know some people were watching on YouTube as well. So thank you. I don't want to take up the rest of your time. I know it's early morning for many of you and it's dinner time for the rest of us here. So looking forward to seeing you all in the next session. Thank you to Sam and Sridhar and Praveen for joining us today, and to all of you who made this work.
Thank you. And Rohan, you will post, I'll send you the deck, and it's something that you can circulate for
Certainly. I can even email the deck to the attendees who are there, and we can make sure that they have it as a reference.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this engaging session, and looking forward to Praveen going into much more detail on the broad perspective that you've opened up. There are infinite possibilities, and we are all enthusiasts about photography. So we are very excited to share these things with you. And Praveen will also go into a little bit of what you see on the phone as well in the next session. So he will possibly compare the same shot taken on a phone and same shot taken on the camera, and you will get an idea of like the differences there. So looking forward to the next session. In the meantime, you have 2 weeks, and go ahead and play with. You'll see Sam's deck. There are some recommendations. There are some understandings about these 3 elements of the exposure triangle. Go out and take some shots. Play with these things, and see what the difference is. Because as IITians, once we understand the science behind what we need to do to get what we want, then we are well on our way to getting the perfect shot, right? So that is the whole point behind the series of sessions here, is for you guys to understand, okay, you will always have an idea of what I want from a picture. Now, the camera might be giving you something different, but this series of sessions will tell you what to change in the camera to make sure that the camera gives you what you want. Okay, that is what we want to leave you with. Okay, so looking forward to Praveen's session in 2 weeks. Go ahead and take a lot of photos, post them on the group if you have any things that you want people to react to, and I'm sure we'll get this community going. Thank you so much.